Bastogne, Belgium, December 12, 1944. 4 days before a single shot is fired in what will become the Battle of the Bulge, a German corps commander sits at a map table and dictates an order to his staff. His name is Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz, General der Panzertruppe, commander of the WWII Panzer Corps. He has fought in Poland, he has fought in Russia, he has commanded a panzer division through the hedgerows of Normandy. And now, staring at a small crossroads town that barely appears on most maps of Belgium, he writes a line that will end up quoted in Allied intelligence files for the rest of the war. Bastogne, he tells his division commanders, must be taken and taken quickly. Because if it is not taken, he writes, it will remain what he calls an ulcer on the German lines of communication. An ulcer, not a fortress, not a stronghold, a wound that won't close. Von Leutwitz does not yet know the name of the American regiment that is about to make his prediction come true. He does not know that within 2 weeks, his own liaison officers will hand-deliver a surrender ultimatum to that regiment's division, and receive, in reply, a single word that will outlive every general's order written that December. This is not the Hollywood version of Bastogne. This is not the postcard image of American paratroopers in white snow capes, grinning through the cold. This is the story as the German command itself recorded it in corps orders and after-action reports, in the ultimatum they wrote with their own hand, and in the memoirs several of these officers published after the war, when there was no longer any reason to lie about who had beaten them and how. To understand why von Leutwitz's assessment carries weight, you have to understand what he had already survived by December of 1944. He was not a desk general. He had been wounded in the invasion of Poland in 1939, shot by a sniper 3 days after the campaign had effectively already been decided. He fought through the opening of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, commanding a Schutzen regiment on the Eastern Front, where he was awarded the Knight's Cross for holding a position against 2 Soviet armies near Ugra. By 1942, he commanded the 20th Panzer Division. In the summer of 1944, he took command of the 2nd Panzer Division, and briefly in the chaotic weeks before the Normandy campaign, he had held command of a Waffen-SS armored division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division des Reich, before returning to lead Army armor at Falaise, where his own citation credits him with helping direct German units to safety through the collapsing pocket. By the time he took command of the WWII Panzer Corps on the 4th of September 1944, Heinrich von Leutwitz was one of the most combat-experienced panzer commanders left in the German order of battle. He was not a man given to exaggeration. When he called a town an ulcer, he meant it as a precise military judgment, not a figure of speech. That judgment turned out to be the most accurate thing anyone said about Bastogne all winter. 2 years earlier and 4,000 miles away, in the red clay hills of northeast Georgia, a different kind of army was being built, one designed from its first day to be everything the Wehrmacht's timetable had not accounted for. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was constituted on July 1, 1942, and activated at a raw, half-finished training camp called Tukoa. Its commander, Colonel Robert Sink, made one decision early that would define the unit for the rest of the war. Every man in the regiment would be a volunteer. No one was assigned to the 506th. Every soldier who wore its wings had chosen specifically to jump out of an airplane into combat, and had chosen to run Curry, the 3-mile mountain behind camp, over and over until it was less a hill than a religion. 3 miles up, 3 miles down. We run down, we don't walk down, the men used to say, because Sink's training philosophy held that a unit conditioned past the point of comfort would hold together past the point most units broke. By December of 1944, the 506th had already jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through Operation Market Garden in Holland. They were not fresh troops. They were resting and refitting at Camp Mermelin in France, many of them still recovering from the Netherlands campaign when the orders came. On December 16, 1944, von Leutwitz's prediction began to test itself against reality. German forces launched the Ardennes Offensive, the operation that would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, with the goal of driving through Belgium to the port of Antwerp before the Allies could regroup. Because nearly every road through the densely forested Ardennes highlands converged at one crossroads town, Bastogne was, from the first hour of the offensive, a German objective by necessity, not by choice. On the evening of December 17th, the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, including the 506th, was ordered out of reserve. They left Camp Mermelin on the afternoon of the 18th with no time to properly re-equip. Many men went into the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades without winter coats, without enough ammunition, without maps of the ground they were about to defend. The 506th arrived at Bastogne on December 19th and was immediately split. 2 battalions moved into reserve positions north of the town. The 1st Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade, was sent 6 miles north to a small village called Novel, directly into the path of the German 2nd Panzer Division, commanded in the field by Colonel Meinrad von Lochert. What followed at Novel is, according to the American after-action record itself, one of the costliest 48 hours the regiment fought in the entire war. A small armored task force, Team de Sabri from the 10th Armored Division, had already been fighting for hours before the 506th arrived, blind in a fog so thick that neither side could see more than a few dozen yards. Major William de Sabri had rolled into Naval at 11 o'clock the night before, with darkness making it impossible to judge the ground he was expected to defend. He sent 3 small teams out to block the roads leading into the village from the west and north, and through the night a flood of stragglers, American soldiers separated from broken units elsewhere along the line, streamed past his positions. De Sabri pulled some of them in to reinforce his own thin numbers. Others, too shaken to fight, he let pass. At around 5:30 on the morning of the 19th, contact came. A German reconnaissance element probed the Bercy Road. By 6:30, Sergeant Major Jones was holding the main highway roadblock when the first German tanks came into view. He opened fire. The reply was immediate, 2 of his own tanks destroyed by 3 German panzers that pushed his section back toward the village. A second American roadblock on the Vaux Road was abandoned under the same pressure. By mid-morning, the fog that had covered the entire action to that point began briefly to lift, and de Sabri understood, for the first time, exactly what he was facing. Not a probing patrol, not a reconnaissance screen. An entire panzer division deploying on the ridgelines that ringed the village on 3 sides. He radioed Bastogne and asked permission to withdraw to Foy, a mile closer to the American perimeter and easier to hold. Colonel Roberts, his brigade commander, told him reinforcements were already on the way and asked him to hold. De Sabri chose to stay. "I will prepare a counterattack," he told them. The reinforcement was the 1st Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade, ordered into Naval almost by accident. Laprade's battalion was marching north through Bastogne toward its assigned reserve position when Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, the division's assistant commander, flagged down Colonel Robert Sink, the 506th regimental commander, in the street and redirected the entire battalion to Naval on the spot. Laprade's men arrived at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon and immediately organized a joint counterattack with de Sabri's remaining tanks to clear the high ground north of the village. The attack went forward at 2:30 and ran directly into a German counterattack launched at the same hour. The 2 forces collided head-on in open ground. American paratroopers advanced far enough to gain a foothold on some of the ridgelines, but were thrown back with heavy losses by nightfall. As the survivors fell back into Naval, a German artillery shell struck the building serving as the joint command post. Lieutenant Colonel Laprade, who had marched his men into the village less than 5 hours earlier, was killed instantly. Major de Sabri, standing nearby, was struck by shrapnel and severely wounded. He was evacuated in the dark, never to see how the battle he had refused to abandon would end. Command of the defense fell to Major Robert Harwick. Night brought no relief, only small German probing attacks, tanks and infantry testing the perimeter in the dark while Naval burned, the flames muted by drifting fog and smoke. At dawn on the 20th, 2 German tanks pushed straight into the village center and stopped beside a house. An American bazooka team destroyed the first. A Sherman commanded by Sergeant Lesniak destroyed the second at point-blank range and took a hit from a 3rd German tank moments later, damaged but still able to fight. By mid-morning, the fog lifted completely, and what the defenders saw when it cleared was, in the words of the men who were there, an entire armored division arrayed on the high ground around them, 14 German tanks visible moving in column along a single ridge to the north. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion rushed up to support the perimeter, opened fire with their 90mm guns. In a matter of minutes, they destroyed 10 of the 14 tanks in view, catching the German column in the open before it could disperse. It was, by the account of the men who fired the guns, like a shooting gallery. But ammunition ran low quickly and the German shelling of the village did not stop. De Sabri's replacement, now commanding what remained of Team de Sabri, renamed Team Husted after his evacuation, again requested permission to withdraw. This time it was granted. The withdrawal on the afternoon of December 20th was its own battle. An armored car led 4 half-tracks and 5 Sherman tanks out of Naval, escorting a column of vehicles carrying the wounded, Laprade's body among them, with Company C of the 506th providing rearguard cover. Fog closed in again just as the column began to move. Halfway to safety, the retreating Americans discovered that Foy, the village they were withdrawing through, had already been captured by the Germans in a separate attack. The column had to fight its way through the town it had planned to pass through peacefully. Engineers detonated explosives in the Foy church steeple as the last vehicles cleared it, denying German artillery spotters a vantage point and blocking the road behind them with rubble. Colonel Robert Sink stood at the edge of the American lines and shook the hand of every exhausted, filthy paratrooper as he came in. By the time the survivors reached safety, 1st Battalion, 506th, had lost 13 officers and 199 enlisted men out of roughly 600 who had marched into Naval less than 48 hours earlier, a casualty rate above 50%. Team de Sabri had lost half its strength, along with 11 of its 15 tanks and all but 4 of its tank destroyers. Against them, the 2nd Panzer Division had lost an estimated 20 to 30 tanks and roughly 600 men. For the Germans, replaceable losses. What was not replaceable was time. 2 days had been spent taking one village that, in the end, they still did not fully hold. 2 days the German timetable to the Meuse River could not afford to lose. Accounts differ slightly on the exact tank losses at Novel. Some American records credit the defenders with disabling or destroying more than 30, but every source, German and American, agrees on the outcome that mattered most. The crossroads at Bastogne did not fall, and the men who bought the time to hold it were paratroopers of the 506th. The names in the after-action reports are ordinary names, attached to men who had been factory workers and farmhands 18 months earlier, and to at least one Belgian civilian whose name is remembered in Bastogne to this day for a choice that had nothing to do with rank or regiment. Major William de Sabry chose to hold Novel when every tactical instinct available to him argued for withdrawal, was wounded carrying that choice out, and was evacuated from a battle he never saw the end of. He survived the war and lived for decades afterward, long enough to see Novel's defense written into the American Army's own official history as one of the actions that made the eventual relief of Bastogne possible at all. Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade marched his battalion into Novel at the head of the column, alongside his regimental commander Colonel Sink, and was killed less than 5 hours later by an artillery shell that struck the building where he had just set up his command post. The record does not preserve his final words. What it preserves is simpler and in its way more honest. He arrived, he took command of a collapsing defense, and within hours he was dead. 600 men held the line he had just walked into. René Lemaire was not a soldier at all. A 30-year-old nurse from Bastogne, she had spent the siege working alongside the American medical staff at an aid station set up in a requisition building near the town center, treating wounded paratroopers with whatever supplies could still be found. On the morning of Christmas Eve, as German bombers began a raid on the town, she refused to leave the building, staying behind to pull wounded soldiers clear of the flames after the structure was struck. She went back in for one more man. A second bomb brought the building down on top of everyone still inside. Captain Jack Pryor, the American doctor she had been working under, described running to the wreckage afterward and finding it already burning, the whole scene lit brighter than day by the flares the German bomber had dropped overhead. René Lemaire died in that collapse, along with roughly 30 of the wounded men she had been trying to save. American soldiers found her body in the ruins and wrapped it in the white silk of a parachute, the same silk she had reportedly been saving to sew into a wedding dress once the war ended. The record does not soften what happened to her, and this script will not either. War does not draw its casualties only from the units listed on an order of battle. Von Leutwitz was not the only German officer trying to explain, in real time, what was happening at Bastogne. Generalmajor Heinz Kockott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, the unit tasked with finishing what the 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr had failed to close, later wrote one of the most detailed German first-hand accounts of the siege, a manuscript history titled The Battle for Bastogne, prepared after the war at the request of U.S. Army historians. In it, Kockott describes a defense that, by every conventional measure of numbers and firepower, should not have held a garrison outnumbered, encircled, and by German intelligence estimates critically low on ammunition, that nonetheless refused every German attempt to dislodge it. There was no German term of art invented for it at the time, but post-war historians studying the German command's own reports have noted a recurring theme in how the officers described the American defense. Not panic, not disorganization, but what one might translate as hartnäckiger Widerstand, stubborn, almost irrational resistance offered by units that German doctrine assumed would break once surrounded and cut off from resupply. They did not break. By December 22nd, Bastogne was fully encircled. Von Leutwitz decided the ulcer could still be lanced with words instead of more armor. 4 German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce and delivered a typewritten note to Major Alvin Jones, commander of 2nd Battalion, 327th Glider Infantry. It was addressed simply to the USA commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. "The fortune of war is changing," the note read. It described German armored units crossing the River Orth, taking Marquet, reaching St. Hubert. It offered the Americans 2 hours to consider the honorable surrender of the encircled town, warning that if the offer was rejected, 1 German artillery corps and 6 heavy anti-aircraft battalions stood ready, in the document's own words, to annihilate the USA troops in and near Bastogne. The note was carried to division headquarters. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, read it, laughed, and reportedly said, "A surrender, oh nuts." When his staff asked what reply he wanted sent back, he told them to just write that down. The typed response that Colonel Joseph Harper personally carried back to the German officers read, in full, To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. The Germans, confused by the American idiom, asked Harper what it meant. He told them plainly that it meant the same as go to hell. Von Leutwitz's guns did not go silent because of one word. On Christmas Eve, with Bastogne's roughly 3,000 remaining civilians and thousands of wounded American soldiers packed into cellars and requisitioned buildings across the town, German bombers came in low over the crossroads. Bombs struck a building being used as a field hospital directly, killing medical staff and wounded men where they lay, among them René Lemaire, the Belgian nurse who had spent the siege treating American casualties. In the seminary, injured soldiers gathered in the chapel and listened to a choir sing Silent Night until the bombing forced the service to break apart. Christmas Day brought Kokot's main assault, a Panzer Grenadier regiment, 2 battalions of self-propelled artillery and 18 tanks, reinforced by nearly every gun the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had left, thrown at the western and southwestern edge of the perimeter near the villages of Hemral and Champs. German armor broke through the lines of the 327th Glider Infantry and 502nd Parachute Infantry, and for a matter of hours, appeared to have achieved the breakthrough von Leutwitz had been waiting 9 days for. One German tank commander radioed Kokot that his tanks were inside Bastogne itself. They were not there for long. American artillery, tank destroyers, and paratroopers with bazookas cut the attack apart in the fields around Hemral. 11 tanks that had broken through were destroyed before nightfall. The Christmas Day assault, the single largest coordinated attack of the siege, failed. The next day, December 26th, tanks of the 4th Armored Division, spearheading General George Patton's 3rd Army, broke through the German ring from the south and opened a corridor into Bastogne. The siege that von Leutwitz had predicted correctly would become an ulcer, had cost the German offensive nearly 2 irreplaceable weeks' time it needed, and never got back to reach the Meuse. Heinrich von Leutwitz did not see the end of the war as a free man. In April 1945, with what remained of Army Group B collapsing in the Ruhr pocket, he was taken prisoner by American forces. He spent more than 2 years in Allied captivity before his release in 1947. He never held command again. He died in Hanover in October 1969, 25 years almost to the month after he had written the word ulcer in a corps order, and without meaning to give in history one of its more accurate one-word summaries of what Bastogne would become for his own army. He got the diagnosis right, he simply never found the cure. An ulcer, von Leutwitz called it, a wound that would not close as long as Bastogne stood. He was not wrong. What he could not have predicted was who would be standing in that wound: farmhands from Ohio and factory workers from Pennsylvania, men who 2 years earlier had never worn a uniform, trained on a hill in Georgia that taught them to run down mountains instead of walking. The German command wrote Bastogne into their war diaries as an obstacle. The men of the 506th wrote it, in blood and frostbite, and a single 4-letter word passed back through enemy lines as an answer. An ulcer does not close because the surgeon wills it. It closes because the body refuses to give the wound what it needs to spread. That refusal, cold, stubborn, unglamorous, paid for by men whose names appear once in a casualty report and never again, is the part the ultimatum never accounted for. Von Leutwitz called it an ulcer. History remembers it as Bastogne. The men who held it never called it anything at all, they just held it.